Somewhere over the North Atlantic, a lone American pilot descends through a break in the clouds. Below him, a German U-boat surfaces, its crew scrambling to man the deck guns. But something is wrong. The submarine's radio antenna sparks and dies. Across the convoy route, other U-boats report the same failure. Communications collapse. The wolf pack cannot coordinate. For weeks, German commanders will not understand why their radios stopped working at the worst possible moments. The answer was flying above them, and it was not a weapon anyone expected. The North Atlantic in 1943 was the coldest battlefield on Earth. Not in temperature alone, though the wind chill at altitude could freeze exposed skin in minutes. It was cold in the way industrial war makes everything cold. Steel hulls, iron discipline, the mechanical patience of hunters waiting beneath gray swells. The Atlantic was where the war's logistics lived and died. Every ton of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every replacement engine bound for Britain had to cross this unforgiving corridor, and beneath its surface, German U-boats waited in packs, coordinated by radio, striking convoys with devastating precision. By early 1943, the Allies were losing the tonnage war. March alone saw over 600,000 tons of shipping sent to the bottom. Merchant sailors died in freezing water, often within sight of rescue vessels that could not reach them in time. The Battle of the Atlantic had become a slow hemorrhage, and the bleeding showed no sign of stopping. The U-boat threat was not merely tactical. It was existential. If the convoys could not get through, Britain would starve. The invasion of Europe would become impossible. The entire Allied strategy in the West hinged on keeping those supply lines open, and the key to the U-boat's success was communication. The Wolfpack doctrine depended on it. A single submarine would spot a convoy, shadow it, and transmit its position to U-boat command in France. From there, Admiral Karl Dönitz would vector other submarines into position, assembling a coordinated assault that could overwhelm escort defenses. The system was elegant, lethal, and entirely dependent on reliable radio contact, which meant, in theory, that radio was also its weakness. But exploiting that weakness required something the Allies did not yet fully possess. Not code-breaking alone, not surface escorts alone, not long-range bombers alone. It required presence, continuous, unpredictable, inescapable presence over the convoy routes, and in the winter of 1943, the U.S. Navy was only beginning to understand what that would take. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. His name does not appear in most histories of the Atlantic War. He was not an ace. He did not sink a famous submarine. He did not receive a Medal of Honor or stand beside admirals at victory parades. He was a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy, a patrol squadron pilot, the kind of officer who spent more time fighting weather than enemies. Before the war, he had been an engineering student in the Midwest, the son of a mechanic who ran a small garage. He grew up around radios, around the early crystal sets and vacuum tubes that his father tinkered with on Sunday afternoons. He understood circuits the way some men understood engines, intuitively, as living systems with their own logic and temperament. He joined the Navy in 1939, not out of patriotism, but out of restlessness. The Depression had dried up engineering jobs, and the Navy offered flight training, adventure, a way out of a town that felt too small. He earned his wings at Pensacola, flew patrol bombers out of Hawaii, and was transferred to the Atlantic in late 1942, assigned to a squadron operating PBY Catalinas out of Iceland. Iceland was not a glamorous posting. The weather was brutal, fog, sleet, and crosswinds that could flip a flying boat on landing. The patrols were long, often 12 to 14 hours over empty ocean, searching for submarines that rarely surfaced during daylight. The cold seeped into the cockpit despite every layer of clothing. The monotony was its own kind of exhaustion. But he paid attention to things other pilots ignored. He noticed, for instance, that the Catalina's radio equipment was unreliable at certain altitudes. He noticed that atmospheric conditions over the North Atlantic played havoc with high-frequency transmissions. He noticed that German submarines often surfaced to transmit just after a patrol aircraft had passed, as if they were tracking the American radio signals and timing their communications accordingly. He began keeping a small notebook, logging every patrol, every radio anomaly, every unexplained transmission he picked up on the receiver. He was not trying to invent anything. He was just trying to understand the environment. And in that understanding, he would find something that no one else had seen. The problem was not that the Allies lacked weapons. By 1943, depth charges had improved. Hedgehog mortars were entering service. Escort carriers were beginning to deploy with convoy groups. The technology existed to kill submarines if they could be found and fixed in place long enough to attack. The problem was finding them. The Atlantic was vast. A U-boat on the surface was a tiny speck against millions of square miles of ocean. Submerged, it was nearly invisible. Radar helped, but early airborne sets were unreliable, heavy, and easily fooled by sea clutter. Visual search remained the primary detection method, and visual search depended on weather, light, and luck. What made the wolf packs so effective was their ability to coordinate without being seen. A shadowing U-boat could transmit brief, coded messages on high-frequency bands, reporting convoy course, speed, and composition. U-boat command would relay instructions to other submarines positioned along the probable route. The pack would assemble, attack at night, and disperse before dawn. The entire system was built on the assumption that radio communication was secure and reliable. Allied cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park were working to break the Enigma codes, and by mid-1943 they would achieve significant success. But code breaking alone could not stop a transmission in progress. It could only reveal what had already been said, often hours or days after the attack had occurred. What was needed was a way to deny the U-boats the ability to communicate in real time, to jam their transmissions, to blind the wolf pack at the moment of coordination. But radio jamming, as it was understood in 1943, was a blunt instrument. Ground-based jammers could blanket large areas, but they required enormous power and fixed installations. Airborne jamming was theoretically possible, but the equipment was heavy, unreliable, and consumed power that patrol aircraft could not spare. The Navy had experimented with electronic countermeasures, but the results were inconsistent at best. The doctrine held that jamming was a strategic tool, not a tactical one. It belonged to ground stations and specialized ships, not to patrol bombers hunting submarines over open ocean. And so the problem remained unsolved. The U-boats talked, and the wolf packs assembled, and the convoys burned. Until one pilot began asking a different question. He did not set out to invent anything. He was simply frustrated with the radio equipment aboard his Catalina. The PBY was a workhorse, but its electronics were a patchwork of pre-war designs and wartime modifications. The high-frequency transmitter was prone to interference. The receiver picked up static that seemed to have no source. On long patrols, the radio man spent as much time troubleshooting as communicating. One afternoon, during a maintenance layover in Iceland, he sat with the squadron's chief radio man and began tracing the source of a persistent interference pattern. They discovered that one of the transmitter's output stages was oscillating at an unexpected frequency. It was a minor malfunction, the kind that would normally be corrected with a component swap. But he noticed something curious. When the oscillation occurred, the receiver picked up a faint echo of German transmissions. not clear enough to decode, but recognizable by their characteristic rhythm and frequency. And then, abruptly, the German signals would drop out. He asked the radio man to reproduce the oscillation intentionally. The German signals dropped out again. It was not jamming in the traditional sense. The Catalina's transmitter was not powerful enough to blanket an entire frequency band, but it was generating enough interference, at just the right frequency, to disrupt nearby receivers. And in the North Atlantic, where atmospheric conditions already degraded radio signals, even modest interference could push a transmission below the threshold of intelligibility. He realized that the Catalina was, inadvertently, blinding any U-boat within a few miles of its flight path. He brought the observation to his commanding officer. The response was polite, but dismissive. The Navy had protocols for radio discipline. Intentionally generating interference violated those protocols. It could affect Allied communications as easily as enemy ones. The idea was interesting but impractical. He was told to focus on flying his patrols. He did not argue. He was a lieutenant commander, not a scientist. He had no authority to requisition equipment or conduct experiments. He was just a pilot who had noticed something odd, but he did not stop thinking about it. Over the following weeks, he refined his understanding of the phenomenon. He mapped the atmospheric conditions that amplified the effect. He calculated the frequencies most likely to disrupt German naval bands. He sketched modifications to the transmitter that would allow the oscillation to be triggered deliberately, controlled, and aimed. He shared none of this with his superiors. Instead, he waited for an opportunity. The opportunity came in April 1943. A large convoy, designated HX-233, was crossing the mid-Atlantic when U-boat command detected its presence. Dönitz ordered a wolf pack to assemble along the convoy's projected route. The pack included at least a dozen submarines, spread across a 100-mile arc, waiting for the shadowing boat to transmit final coordinates. The escort group was aware of the threat. Radio intercepts had warned of increased U-boat activity in the area, but the convoy was too far from land-based air cover. The only aircraft available were the Catalinas from his squadron, operating at extreme range. He was assigned to fly the afternoon patrol, the longest and most monotonous leg of the coverage cycle. Before takeoff, he made a small modification to the Catalina's radio equipment. It was not authorized. He did not log it. He simply adjusted the transmitter's tuning circuit to allow the oscillation pattern he had observed to be triggered by a toggle switch. His radio man noticed the change but said nothing. Trust in the crew was implicit. The patrol began in overcast conditions. Visibility was poor. The sea below was a gray smear broken by whitecaps. For the first 4 hours, they saw nothing but clouds and water. Then the radio man reported German transmissions, faint, fragmented but unmistakable. A U-boat was transmitting, probably the shadower, reporting the convoy's position. He did not have a visual on the submarine. He did not know its exact location, but he knew approximately where the transmission was coming from, and he knew the convoy was passing through that sector. He made a decision. He dropped the Catalina through a break in the clouds, descending to just a few hundred feet above the waves. At this altitude, the transmitter's range would be limited, but the interference effect would be concentrated. He triggered the oscillation. For the next 20 minutes, he flew a racetrack pattern over the suspected transmission zone, holding the toggle switch down, generating a continuous interference signal on the frequencies most likely to carry German naval traffic. He could not know if it was working. He could not see the submarine. He could not hear the German transmissions drop out. All he could do was fly the pattern and hope. Eventually, fuel constraints forced him to climb and return to base. He filed a routine patrol report. He did not mention the modification, But that night, the convoy escorts reported something unusual. The expected wolf pack attack had not materialized. Several U-boats had surfaced briefly, as if attempting to transmit, but no coordinated assault had developed. The convoy passed through the danger zone with only minor contact, losing no ships. The next day, decoded intercepts revealed that U-boat command had been unable to establish reliable communication with the shadowing submarine. The pack had failed to assemble. He said nothing, but over the following weeks he repeated the technique on subsequent patrols. He refined the timing, he adjusted the frequencies, he taught his radio man to monitor for German transmissions and trigger the interference at the optimal moment. His squadron's convoy coverage statistics began to improve, not dramatically, but measurably. Convoys patrolled by his aircraft experienced fewer coordinated attacks. U-boats in his sectors seemed disoriented, hesitant, unable to concentrate their forces. His commanding officer noticed the trend. He asked what had changed. He told the truth. He explained the modification. He showed the sketches. There was a long silence, and then the commanding officer picked up the telephone. Within weeks, the modification was being evaluated by the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. Engineers confirmed that the technique was viable. The oscillation pattern he had discovered exploited a known vulnerability in German receiver circuits. Under the right atmospheric conditions, even a low-power interference signal could effectively silence a U-boat's communications for the duration of an aircraft's patrol. The effect was not absolute. It did not jam every frequency, and it did not work at long range. But it created a zone of radio silence around the patrolling aircraft, a moving bubble of disruption that followed the Catalina across the convoy route. For the U-boats, this was disorienting. Their doctrine depended on the assumption that they could communicate freely while submerged or running on the surface at night. They had no way of knowing that an aircraft overhead was actively disrupting their transmissions. They only knew that contact with U-boat command was suddenly unreliable, that instructions were garbled, that other boats were not responding. The modification was designated informally as a radio countermeasure device, though it had no official name. It was installed on a trial basis in several Catalina squadrons operating out of Iceland and Newfoundland. By summer 1943, convoy losses in the North Atlantic were declining. The reasons were multiple: escort carriers, improved radar, ultra-intelligence, better tactics, more aircraft. It would be impossible to isolate the contribution of one modification on a handful of patrol bombers, but the trend was unmistakable. Wolfpack coordination was breaking down. U-boats were surfacing and submerging erratically, as if uncertain of their instructions. Attacks were becoming scattered, opportunistic, less lethal. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning. And somewhere in that turning, invisible to most historians, was the work of one pilot who had paid attention to a radio malfunction and refused to let it go. The modification was never widely publicized. It was never given a formal designation or included in official histories. After the war, it was absorbed into the broader category of electronic countermeasures, attributed to teams of engineers and laboratories. But in the convoy records of 1943, in the after-action reports of escort groups and patrol squadrons, there are traces of its influence. There are convoys that should have been attacked and were not. There are wolf packs that assembled too slowly, communicated too poorly, and arrived too late. There are sailors who lived because a radio malfunctioned at exactly the right moment. He finished the war as a commander, assigned to a training squadron in the continental United States. He never returned to combat duty. He never sought recognition for the modification he had developed. After the war, he returned to engineering, working for a company that manufactured radio equipment for the nascent airline industry. He married. He raised children. He rarely spoke about the war. Decades later, when historians began reconstructing the electronic warfare campaigns of World War II, they found references to improvised countermeasures employed by patrol squadrons in the North Atlantic. They found notes about radio oscillation techniques used to disrupt U-boat communications. They found, in the papers of one deceased engineering executive, a small notebook filled with frequency calculations and atmospheric diagrams. The connection was made quietly, posthumously. No ceremony, no retrospective medal, just a footnote in a technical history acknowledging that one pilot had noticed something others missed and had the persistence to act on it. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by a single weapon or a single idea. It was won by thousands of small decisions, each one shaving a fraction of a percent off the odds facing the convoys. Depth charges and radar and ultra and escort carriers all played their parts. But so did the men who flew endless patrols over cold gray water, who studied their equipment as carefully as their charts, who understood that in industrial war, even a radio malfunction could be turned into an advantage. He never claimed credit. He never needed to. The convoys got through. The war was won. The men who sailed those ships and flew those patrols went home to lives their enemies had tried to prevent. That was the only recognition that mattered. And sometimes, late at night, when the radio crackled with static and the wind howled outside, he would remember the moment he had descended through the clouds, flipped a toggle switch, and watched the silence spread. He had not fired a shot, but he had blinded the wolf pack, and in the long arithmetic of war, that was enough.